Good morning, everyone. Wow, it's wonderful. I'm already on. Yeah. Did we have a good Christmas and New Year? Oh, that's great. Well, we stand right now at the start of a new year. And often at this time, most people would reflect on their purpose and goal or vision or aspiration for this coming year, right? Well, I think one of the most important things to reflect upon is really, apart from resolutions and goals and so on, one of the most important thing to reflect upon is our eternal destiny. Because all other goals are founded upon that big and the greatest goal, our eternal destiny. Over Christmas and New Year, I was led to look into, in between cakes and all the, rich food and so on, I was led to look into the book of Hebrews. And over some days, I got 4 sermon titles out of that book. In other words, you can collapse the book of Hebrews, containing 13 chapters, into 4 sermons. Well, I'm not going to cram all 4 into one Sunday today. I'm going to do the first of the 4 today. And here are the 4 sermon titles. No Turning Back today. The next one, By Faith. And the next one, Why So Much Suffering? And the last one, The Kindness and Severity of God. So, in other words, you can collapse the entire book into 4 half-hour sermons. Well, today, I want to share 2 thoughts with us on no turning back. The year was about AD 65. A Christian leader, possibly Paul, possibly must be an apostle, or an associate of an apostle, started to notice some things that were disconcerting, that were a concern to him. Because there were some Christians who were beginning to falter and they were contemplating turning back and returning to where they were before. And these Christians were Jewish Christians. They were converts from Judaism. They had been converted. They believed in Jesus as being the Messiah. And now they were deciding, they were contemplating, should we turn back? Now, to be a Jewish Christian in the first century is something highly dangerous. Because you're not just falling foul of the Jewish law, because your fellow Jews would look at you with disdain. They would say, that sect, they have departed from what our fathers believed in. So they've got that distrust and enmity from their fellow Jews. As well, they have a lot of anger, distrust from the Roman government. Because in Rome tolerated all manner of religions, and Judaism was an official religion recognized by the Roman authorities, but not the way, not the sect. Because the sect, which is the Christian way, says there is another Lord apart from Caesar. And so that angered the Romans. Because of such opposition to their faith, these early Jewish Hebrew Christians were starting to wonder, should we turn back? Maybe all of this is just a made-up thing. We could turn back and live lives easier, cozier. It'll be far better than doing life always on the run, always being persecuted. The signs of apostasy, in other words, the signs of turning back, were abundant. And so this leader decided, I've got to share something. I cannot just stand here and keep quiet. If you were an apostle in the first century and you noticed such turning back happening, what would you do? What would you write? Well, the author to the book of Hebrews, to the Hebrews, wrote this again and again and again. He is a long-winded preacher and author. He repeats himself. It's like that phrase, say that once more time again, or repeat that once more time again. A lot of verbosity. He just repeats and repeats and repeats. I'm going to call out two things that he repeats himself. There are many. There are several. This is not the answer. This is an answer. So here are two things. Two things that the author of the book of Hebrews repeats himself on. The first thing, there is that repeated reminder to avoid unbelief. He repeats himself to this group of Hebrew Jewish Christians who were contemplating. They have not yet decided we're going to turn back. They were at the brink. They were at the cusp of just turning back, but they didn't yet. So he writes to them, reminding them repeatedly against unbelief. That unbelief, that word, is translated sometimes in our English Bibles as disobedience, refusal. Those are the words. But that word unbelief itself is mentioned at least 6 times in this letter. So he repeats himself, this writer. And in addition to the use of that word unbelief 6 times over, he devotes 2 chapters, Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, to talking about the unbelief of all Israel in the wilderness. So this is something he's really, really emphasizing. Let me read some sample verses for us. Hebrews chapter 3, verses 12, 18, and 19. Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart. That's that unbelieving. Leading you to fall away from the living God. Verse 18. And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? That's unbelief. That's that word. 19, so we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. He repeats, unbelief is extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous because unbelief is the root of sin. Unbelief really says, I want satisfaction and fulfillment for myself. I am going to have that fulfillment without needing to depend on God's promises. That's unbelief. I reject having to submit to God for my satisfaction. That's unbelief. Now, there's a difference between doubt and unbelief. Let me point it out this way. Doubt says, and rather wimpishly, and with that tone of distress and anxiety inside. This is doubt. Doubt says it in this manner. I don't know if I can believe this. I really want to believe. I really want Jesus. I won't walk away from him, but I'm not sure. With that unsettledness and distress, that's doubt. And that's okay. Well, okay for a while. Here is unbelief. Unbelief says the same words, but but with a sneer and with contempt. This is what unbelief says. I don't know if I can believe this. I don't really need to believe. Who does he think he is anyway? I refuse to believe. That's unbelief. You remember where did unbelief comes from? The devil. I refuse to bow and worship when all the other angels did. That's unbelief. So, having repeated himself many times about the danger of unbelief, the writer of the book of Hebrews takes his audience, which is the first century New Testament Jewish Christians, back 1400 years to the wilderness wanderings of ancient Israel. Israel had been rescued from Egypt through the Red Sea, you remember, okay? It's now a year. It's now a year since they crossed the Red Sea on dry ground. They've witnessed manna falling down from the sky, feeding them whenever they're hungry. They've witnessed, whenever they're thirsty, water gushing out from the rock at the command of Moses. They have witnessed at Mount Sinai, the giving of the law and the terrifying experience, thunder and lightning. And they have witnessed the worship of that golden calf, and how Moses, on returning from the top of the mountain, Moses ground that idol into powder, mixed it with water, and forced the rebels to drink it. And then they complained. They said, this manna, we're tired and fed up with manna. Give us meat. And God said to Moses, tell Israel, you shall have meat. Not just one day, nor 2 days. You shall have meat for the whole month. And that meat, you shall have it until you are fed up. And that meat will come out from your nostrils. That's what God said to Moses. Tell Israel that because God stands against unbelief. The unbelief. He saw the unbelief of Israel. There's a lesson here. They complain and stop complaining. Don't murmur. Don't complain. This should be a lesson for us. And then quail was swept by the wind. Israel saw this. The wind swept quail from the sea onto dry ground, and the Israelites could catch them, boil or roast or barbecue, whatever, and they had meat until, and the Bible says this, while the meat was between their teeth, the anger of the Lord was kindled, and the Lord struck down the people with a very great plague, and many died. Now, all that was behind them. All that took place within a year from their rescue from Egypt. And now Moses sends 12 spies into the promised land because Israel were now standing right at the border of the promised land. He sent 12 spies in. You know the story. 10 of the spies came back and said, that land is horrible. We saw the sons of Anak. They were giants, and we have no way of overpowering them. And 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, came back and say, if God had promised, look at the conversation of faith. If God had promised, we will be able to overcome. And so they stood. This is democracy. 10 is weightier than 2. So Israel stood at the border while wallowing in their pain and self-pity and unbelief. And they refused to enter in. Why is this story important to us today? Some 2,000 years after the early apostle wrote the book of Hebrews. Well, because there is that possibility amongst us that some of us may be standing right at the edge of the door of heaven, and we might never enter in. Because if it's not that case, why would the author write this? This is not about Old Testament or New Testament, not that great divide. This is written by a New Testament author for a New Testament church among Christians. We're talking about Christians. That possibility remains. How does unbelief develop? How does unbelief develop? Well, number one, drifting. Unbelief develops through drifting. Hebrews chapter 2, verses 1, 2, and 3. I'll read this out. Therefore, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard. I want to pause there for a little while. It's translated much closer attention. It didn't say we must pay some attention. It says much closer attention. That original word really means we must pay exceeding, abundant attention to what we are hearing, lest we drift away from it. Verse 2, for since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? New Testament. This is a New Testament scripture, not Old Testament. How shall we escape such a great salvation? Right at the start of this letter, the author of the book of Hebrews says, don't drift. Don't ever drift. Pay abundant, over and exceeding attention to what you're hearing. Because you know why? Some of them were starting to drift. They were starting to drift. That's why he wrote in chapter 10 of Hebrews, and let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some. Habit. It's their habit to avoid church services, gathering together. And that's how you drift. When you use a boat, when you come on shore, you tie that boat to a jetty or a pontoon, because otherwise the currents would cause the boat to, thank you, drift. So you need the anchor of Jesus Christ. Pay exceeding abundant attention, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some. What else would cause unbelief? Here's another cause. Unbelief comes through being dull of hearing. Again, that Pastor Jim, that Pastor Randall, that Pastor Pavey. Enough. Dull of hearing. Hebrews 5:11. About this, we have much to say, and it is hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic principles of the oracles of God, of the doctrines of God. Now, he's not talking about super duper teaching. He's talking about here the very basic elementary ABCs 101 of the Christian faith. And he's saying, you guys in that Hebrew diaspora, you guys are still needing someone to tell you after all these years. You've not grown a bit. Dull of hearing. Number 3, how does unbelief develop? Well, the third one, defying God. We start to defy God. Hebrews 12:25. See that you do not refuse. That's defiance. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking. And this is the contrast now. For if they in the Old Testament days did not escape when they defied him who warned them on Mount Sinai on earth, much less will we in the New Testament era if we defy him and reject him who warns from heaven. I know God is a God of grace and love. Look, that's 101 Christianity, okay? But God has not changed. He didn't, oh my, this is now I'm going into the New Testament era. I better drop off my severity and put on more love. God doesn't change. When the law was given at Mount Sinai and the people were disciplined and chastised and punished severely, God is a God of judgment as well. There are repeated warnings in the book of Hebrews. 5 times the author gives straightforward, unvarnished, undiluted warnings, just straight from the hip. 5 times. Why? Because unbelief is so serious. Because drifting, and because dullness of hearing, and because defying God is so serious. Right, so this is the first reminder. He reminds and he reminds and he repeats himself. Avoid unbelief. Avoid unbelief. This is a 2-point sermon, okay? So the second reminder that he gives is this. There are repeated reminders to focus on the better. Reminders to focus on the better. I said earlier, one of the reasons why the Hebrew Christians were standing at the border. Let's turn back. You know why? These Hebrew Christians met in churches in homes. They were the original home churches, small little groups. And that's something else. I was going to say a small church is better than a mega church. Let's not go there. Small church is good. It's good. That's the original pattern. Close fellowship and all that. So these Hebrew Christians were saying, here we are under surveillance. We are persecuted. We are being watched. And look over there is that temple, beautiful, with the massive stones. You remember the disciples said to Jesus, look, Master, what beautiful stones, what massive stones. And Jesus said, don't look at them with envy, because one day it's coming. Not a stone will be on another, because that temple will be totally destroyed. And that came to pass. But anyway, these Christians would be having church services in their homes. They saw that massive temple and they said, we're losing out. We could have been in that temple. So beautiful, undeterred, no troubles, no trials. What are we doing here? That's better. But the author to the book of Hebrews inserts the word better, more, greater, superior, 25 times in his letter. 25 times he says, Jesus is better. His sacrifice is better. His temple is better. His priesthood is better. He is better than Aaron and Moses and Joshua. He is better than Melchizedek. Better. Jesus is better. He's driving home that point. And therefore, don't turn back. That's what he's saying to them. Don't turn back to Judaism. Christ is better. Better than angels, better than everything else. There are many reasons why Christians turn back. What is one major reason? Well, look at this. Paul, writing to Timothy in the last chapter of his known writings before he was beheaded. Paul wrote this. Everyone's forsaken me. Demas, who loves this world, has gone to Thessalonica, a castaway, and also ran. But he didn't follow through. He turned back. Demas. Why did he turn back? Why Thessalonica? Well, maybe in Thessalonica there were many things that appealed to Demas. To Demas, these things were better. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, these things appealed to, these satisfy me, make me happy. I don't need to depend on God. I can make it to fulfillment on my own without Christ. Better. And Demas turned back because he harbored idolatry. Anything that you regard higher than Christ, that's idolatry. That's an idol. There are 2 commandments, the first 2 commandments of the 10 commandments. Many Christians do not know this. It's important because we have compartmentalized the Bible. We say the 10 commandments, Old Testament stuff, doesn't apply. Rubbish. They do apply. Here are the first 2. Exodus 20, verse 3. You shall have no other gods before me. It was true then when they made idols out of metal and wood and whatever. Today, it is similarly true for us. We make idols. Not of things, but we make idols that are invisible, that we put higher than God. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image of anything either in the sky or on earth or underneath in the water, and bow before it and serve it, because the Lord is a jealous God. And He's still a jealous God. James tells us that. There is that continuity between the Old Testament and the New. Colossians 1:18 says, He is the head of the body. Christ is the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything He might be preeminent. That is the most important thing to regard concerning holding idols in our hearts. Christ is preeminent. We need to fight the temptation to indulge in idolatry, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. And we do so by repeatedly looking at the better, which is Christ. That's what the author is trying to tell us. He is better. He is better. Not these things in Thessalonica. Christ is better. Numbers 13 and 14. The author talked about this in Hebrews. He pulls out these happenings in the wanderings. He inserts them in his book. And he says this: Israel were tempted to look back. And this is how they did it. They said, look, why did you bring us out of Egypt, Moses? It was better there. They had forgotten. They had forgotten about the slavery. They had forgotten about the enslavement in Egypt. But to them, that's better. Look, we had fish to eat. We had melons, and we had cucumbers. We had leeks and onions and garlic. Give us Egypt. Unbelief has a way of glamorizing that which is clearly inferior to God, because Christ is better, not Egypt. Whenever we entertain something in the heart that displaces God, that's idolatry. And we need to repeatedly tell ourselves, keep looking at Jesus. Keep looking at Jesus. That's why the book of Hebrews, this is another word he repeats. Consider. Consider Jesus. He repeats himself. Consider Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. I want to end with a story. It was 1939. a young man in his 20s, will soon be ordained as a minister with the Assemblies of God in the United States of America. He had a fiancée who was a few years younger than him, and they were in love, and they were going to get married. And that year, 1939, they got married. And a few short months thereafter, he got ordained as an Assemblies of God preacher. Both of them, this young girl and this young boy, still in his 20s, they were both gifted musicians. He was a preacher, he was a pastor. They were both gifted music writers, do you say that word? And musicians. They could play a variety of musical instruments, the piano and so on. And so, having gotten married, they started traveling to minister in different churches. And when they sang, people came to the cross to give their lives to Jesus. A few short years thereafter, that young lady started to drift. She started to say, there is something better. Apart from just doing this thing with my young husband, going around church to church, she started to drift. And she consorted with other men. She loved the allurements of this world. And she started to sing in nightclubs. She was a good singer. She was beautiful. And she went into the nightclub circuit, still married legally, but they had separated. She had separated from him. He tried very hard to win her back. All manner of attempts to woo her back, but she refused. She had gone to Thessalonica. Then, after about 8 or 9 years of their official marriage, they officially divorced. This young man, now barely into his 30s, still very young, was a pastor and preacher and musician and going around. He fell into a deep depression because fellow ministers were pointing their fingers of accusation at him. What kind of a minister are you? Your marriage has busted. Look at your wife, ex-wife, or current wife, but no longer current, singing in nightclubs. And what a name to the gospel. You know what I'm saying? It's disgrace to your ministry. He was driving one day, and he fell into a deep, deep depression. What am I going to do with my life? And they are right. Doubts started to rise in his mind. They are right. I'm a disgrace to the gospel. I can't even keep my household together, and so on and so on. As he was driving his car, suddenly he caught himself singing a tune because, he was very gifted musically. And words started to form in his mouth. He was in deep sorrow, pain, and crying. And the words came and the melody came. He rushed back into his house, went to the piano, and started to get the song lyrics and the music out. And here is the song. And the Assemblies of God it was penned in 1950. In that era, the Assemblies of God in America were viewed quite dimly by the other mainline churches, not like today, all right? But his song has been received and been a blessing to millions. Presbyterians, Church of Christ, Baptists, what have you. They love that song. So I'm going to play that song for us because it blessed my heart. As a young teenager in our church, an Assemblies of God church in Malaysia, our little hymn book, I remember that author, they've got that song, the lyrics, and the author and name and all that at the heading at the top. Ira Stanfield. And I love that name, Ira. Anyway, let me play that song in a moment. But we're going to do things a little bit differently morning. We're not having the musicians to come up to end the service. We're going to end the service with that song, which he wrote out of his pain, out of his depression and suffering. And for those of you who are online, we will send a link on Facebook so that you can listen and view that song as well. But thank you for joining us, those of you online. Be blessed. Have a great week. If there's anything you need to ask us, please do. Reach out and talk to us. God bless you.